Hey, everybody, it's Michael Shermer. It's time for another episode of the Michael Shermer Show. Have I got a winner for you today? This is a subject I've long been interested in. As you know, I've written a bit about what we might do when we set up a colony on Mars. What will Musk do for his political system or economic system or taxes or roads, conflict resolution? How are we going to do all that on Mars? Well, there have been many experiments here on Earth, and my guest today is somebody who's trying to start his own, well, I don't know if I'd say a country, but some kind of a planned community. These are called a ZEDE, Zone for Employment and Economic Development. He's doing this in Honduras. Eric, nice to see you. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on, Michael.
Yeah. So when your publicist or whoever that was that contacted me reached out, I thought, man, this is somebody I would love to talk to because, as I mentioned at the start here, how do you set up a new country or zone of living and doing business and surviving? I have no idea other than kind of the egghead political theory books that I've read, but I've never actually met anybody that tried to do something like this. So give us a little bit of background. Where are you from? Where'd you go to school? How'd you get into all the different things I just introduced you as?
Sure. I was born and raised in Venezuela in South America, a country that by any measure should be one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but unfortunately it's one of the poorest. I grew up thinking and wondering why that was the case, but it wasn't until I went to college near Boston at Babson College, and I studied entrepreneurship and economic development, that I realized that the problem that my country of birth was facing and why there was so much poverty instead of prosperity is because there was a lack of good governance. There's certain basic principle services that we take for granted or had taken for granted in the US, which are painfully missing in many parts of the world. And because there's a lack of good governance, there's no rule of law, there's no property rights protection, there's no individual rights defense, then economies and populations can't thrive. And that's where you get poverty from. So I grew up wondering what could be done about it. And while at school, I realized that the solution was, in theory, easy because it was empirically very clear that the more economic freedom a society has, the more prosperity that it has as well. So the formula was there, was observable, it's measurable. It's been true throughout the ages and throughout all parts of the world, regardless of race and language and latitude. But it's politically very challenging because if you try to implement these systems, you're leveling the playing field. You're making it equally easy and hard for the little guys as well as the entrenched interests to compete. And you're, in essence, implementing a meritocracy at a societal level if you have economic freedom. And there's a lot of vested interests that don't want to see that happen. And in most developing economies, the institutions are not strong enough to withstand the vested interests of cronies. And therefore, over time, they give way to increasingly anti-competitive measures that are initially put forth as regulations to protect the customers and the public, but in reality, they evolve to be nothing more than barriers of entry to would-be competitors and ways to preserve positions of privilege for larger incumbents. So realizing that it was politically challenging, the answer had to be about how to implement those policies successfully. And so we looked around in different parts of the world and realized that there was a trend throughout the world of the creation of special economic zones. Nowadays, there's over 5,000 special economic zones, and they vary in size and type and focus. But the thing that is common amongst all of them is that they're part of a host nation, but within the physical territory, it is accepted that there's going to be a different set of rules. And the difference can vary. Sometimes it's just about taxes. Other times it's about labor law. Sometimes it's more comprehensive. So you can think of there is a spectrum of variability between the host nation and what is true within the zone. The most differentiated, done right, one could argue are areas such as Dubai in the DIFC, or even Hong Kong, which we don't think of as a special economic zone, because it's so substantially different than the host country. But in essence, it's a territory within the country with different rules. So we figured that delivery mechanism was proven to work elsewhere, and wondered what if you could do that as a service? What if you could do it in a partnership structure with a public government with a for-profit intention, but where the profit was derived from successfully creating the conditions so that a population on average could be way more prosperous. And that's where Prospera came from.
That's a great story. Nice introduction. Venezuela. Let's talk about that for a minute. What happened? It seemed like I just came on my radar maybe 5 years ago or so as examples of what conservative social commentators talk about in the United States is what we don't want to do. And of course, they accuse Democrats, the moment you take one step in that direction, you're heading for Venezuela. What happened to Venezuela? So forget that, but just what happened in Venezuela?
Well, what is perceivable now, what's observable now in Venezuela, basically it's a series of socialist policies that an authoritarian government has been using as a way to preserve its power and control its people. But to understand how we got there, you have to realize that for 40 years leading up to the late 90s, there was a system of democracy and capitalism that lent itself to a fake version of capitalism, cronyism. So it though there was democracy and private enterprise, it was very corrupt, and the wealth was concentrated at the top, and there was too much poverty, and that made the population vulnerable to a populist, uh, president want to become elected democratically initially by promising a bunch of goodies, right? Promising free education and promising free this and free that. And of course, the government doesn't have any of that to give away. So the only way to do so is by redistributing wealth. So yeah, a population that's mostly poor combined with a populist, charismatic leader resulted in a gradual and then sudden move towards socialism, redistribution, which destroys the fabric of productive society by discouraging, wealth creation, especially by those that are most capable, since those that are most capable often have the opportunity to just leave. They don't have to put up with that. And so progressively you're left with a country that lacks the most productive members of its society, with an increasing authoritarian government, reduced freedoms, and then it collapses, which is what happened in Venezuela.
Amazing. And who was the dictator or president or whatever, the prime minister that started that process?
Hugo Chavez was elected initially democratically and by a significant margin in 1999. And then in subsequent elections, his support kept falling to the point where his predecessor, Nicolas Maduro, basically lost the election in July of the present year by a landslide. It was 70% to 30, according to the opposition. But they're using all sorts of oppressive mechanisms to stay in power. For now, we'll see what happens with the new Trump administration.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry that happened to your country. That's too bad. But it is a model and a lesson to be learned from history of underlying principles that apply everywhere. Now, you often hear it, some countries are wealthier than others because of natural resources. I'll tee that up for you there. You can have a whack at that.
So-called Dutch disease. Venezuela is, yes, I think, the world's largest deposit of oil, has the largest reserves, but it doesn't have the right economic and political system to encourage the productive development of the oil fields, the distribution, so even though it sits on top unimaginable wealth, there's no system by which to exploit it and for it to reach the population. Now, it is not true that you need natural resources to be prosperous. In fact, there is somewhat of a correlation and called Dutch disease when you have a lot of oil, as an example. It easily fuels corruption because there's a lot of wealth to be taken. So it it amplifies the wrong incentives um, that encourage people to get into politics. If there's a lot of wealth that you can steal, then the wrong people get into politics. And conversely, you have places like Singapore and Hong Kong and Dubai where there was no vast natural resource to speak. I mean, look at Singapore; it's just a small island, but they focused on good governance, and as a result, you have a creative, entrepreneurial class, a business community that leverages that economic freedom to find various creative ways through which to make a living. And of course, they have focused more on services. So you don't need natural resources. What you need is good governance. With good governance, you can be wealthy even if you have no natural resources. And without good governance, you're going to be poor even if you have natural resources.
Yeah. Interestingly, I was just in Dubai last week for a week, and I'd never been. I didn't know much about the UAE, and I kind of just in the back of my mind, well, this must just be oil money. But then when I got to Dubai, they said, no, maybe more in Abu Dhabi, but not so much Dubai. Right. And then I took a little, tour of the history of the country, and basically in the early 70s, it was just sand. There was next to nothing there. We went to the old town of Dubai, and it's just like mud, nothing, just these little 1 or 2 story buildings. And now, of course, I went to the top of the Burj Khalifa, the world's tallest building. But the buildings around it are like 80 stories, 60 stories, 70 stories, and they look tiny. It's just amazing how all that happened in just 50 years. How did that happen?
It's true. It's amazing. And the key to success to Dubai as one of the Emirates of the UAE is exactly the type of formula that we have, you could say, productized so that we can deploy it in partnership with host nations as an economic development tool. And in essence, what they have done, what we think of as Dubai as a city, in reality is a network of about 30 plus different special economic zones, each with separate management, but all inside of a context where they compete against each other. And in that competitive landscape, imagine this, like over 30 special economic zones, the whole United States of 50 states. These special economic zones have a tremendous amount of autonomy to set policy, everything from taxes to regulations. And so they compete to attract investment, to keep companies. So you have a healthcare city, you have an internet city, you got a media city, all within a city. And then, of course, the epitome of it all is the DIFC, Dubai International Financial Center, which did the deepest level of reform to be world-class competitive in one of the toughest industries to compete, which is finance. So that competitive dynamic gets the best of us. I mean, we know this. Competition in every dimension, makes the best of us come through. You have to be better than the rest. Otherwise, you stagnate. So that model of competition in governance proved itself in Dubai. And we think we can do it even better by injecting true entrepreneurialism, free market enterprise, and the profit motive, because Dubai, it's still a monarchy. And so while their structure through competition and partnership with businesses is better, it is not nearly as good as if you put, let's say, international entrepreneurs to compete against each other in providing this vital service of governance. We often don't think of governance as a service. We too easily attach it with the institutions that we have grown accustomed to delivering it, which are governments. But the government is a structural entity. The services of governance is separate. There's no reason why services of governance must be delivered exclusively by this antiquated structural entity called governments, especially the day-to-day management and administration of what most people experience as getting governance services.
Yeah. So what you're doing in Prospera in Honduras is essentially modeling a political platform that you then want to duplicate and repeat elsewhere in the world, because it shouldn't matter what the particular natural resources are of wherever you plop it down and draw your boundaries, right? Am I getting that right? Is that what you're trying to do with Prospera?
Correct. We've developed the methodology. We have a platform that serves as a plug and play, and it can be leveraged in any territory that lawfully can run on the Prosper governance platform. And what we bring with the platform is instant access to international best practices and reciprocity, so that within a Prosper zone, you can have companies from anywhere in the world. They have to follow the local law, obviously, as it relates to the agreement that gave rise to the special economic zone, but the regulatory framework within. So the civil and commercial law, not not criminal law, not sometimes family law, just civil and commercial law. The rules under which they operate inside of a Prosper zone is reciprocal to anywhere else in the world of the OECD countries, and then an increasing number of specialized best practice regulations. And in this environment, what it means basically is a company, for example, from Germany that has an interest in expanding operations to the Western Hemisphere, where we have operations in Honduras, they could choose to operate in a Prosper zone, continuing to follow the laws and the systems that they understand. Let's say the German system, let's say it's a bank. They could continue to follow the German banking regulations, but in a Prosper zone in Central America. And you might ask yourself, why would a company do that? Especially because German banking laws are not necessarily known to be the best. Well, because there's a huge learning curve, and there's also risk mitigation. The German headquarters already knows how to follow German law. They don't want to learn something new. They don't want to be exposed to a series of other rule sets. So you can just import that through reciprocity, and you can apply that to healthcare and education and construction and all sorts of regulated industries. So you have an optimal balance between flexibility and freedom, while retaining a healthy level of dynamic supervision in industries that are more dangerous than others because of the risk that an operator within it can have a substantial amount of negative externality upon non-consenting third parties. That's where some form of regulation could make sense, but it does not make any sense when you only have a one-size-fits-all approach to regulation with centralized power, authority, and access to knowledge. That's not the way markets work.
So is your platform then somewhat flexible based on, I don't know, the different cultures for where you happen to set it up?
Absolutely, yes. Culture is generally encapsulated more in criminal law and family law, but the rules, the standards that make enterprising successful, those tend to be fairly universal. That this is at least this is the empirical evidence, regardless of religion, culture, language, race, latitude. Countries that have a high degree of economic freedom do well, and that's what we focus on. So we can have a prosperous zone in Africa where the native population prefers to keep, let's say, a very conservative standing when it comes to social norms, and that's fine. As long as there's a high degree of economic freedom, you're going to have prosperity.
Yeah, you mentioned Dubai being a monarchy. So you don't have to have a democracy. Like China is not a democracy, but they have a robust economy. So apparently it is possible. Maybe it's not a long-term solution, but temporarily it could prosper with a benign dictator or something like that.
Well, look, democracies is a system of governance, of political government, that is intended to be responsive and accountable to the population under that government. Okay. And vis-a-vis a monarchy, vis-a-vis a dictatorship, it has the potential to be a lot more responsive because people can literally vote their leaders in and out. But the key is that there is responsiveness. Just like in the market, you have market signals for companies that are doing well. They make more money. Companies that do poorly, they make less money. The market system is an extreme case of fluid democracy in a way. If you think about it, every day when people vote with their dollars, they're voting in favor or against different companies. So the market is made up of institutions that are hyper responsive to its customer base. Governments are much less responsive to their customer base, but of the forms of government, democracies are more responsive because once every 4 years or so, the customers get to vote and decide if the leaders are doing a good job or not. So if you think about it in a spectrum of responsiveness, you know, by the leaders to the population, then up until now, democracy can be thought of as the best. But I think we can do better, and that's what we're after. So in the context of a democracy or a monarchy that sets up these special economic zones and allows the Prospera system to operate, inside of the zone, you have a fluid, extreme case of democracy because every day customers are voting for the service provider that gives them the most important service of all, which is governance. And in a way, this is what's happened in Dubai, but it's happening more and more internationally. And candidly, countries, cities, special economic zones that are archaic and slow to respond are going to go out of business. And we're seeing it. Most governments around the world lose money. Customers are very unsatisfied. And quite literally, the structure of the institution is the definition of bureaucracies to slow to respond. And if you don't adjust to market demands, you go out of business. And it might take you longer if you're a big, antiquated institution like a big government, but laws of nature nevertheless apply. So what we're helping to create is a much more dynamic and responsive arm, if you will, of the countries that are partnering with us, so that you have entrepreneurship inside of the system. It's much less disruptive if you have like intrapreneurship within the overall organ, and then we can leapfrog, attract investment, uplift populations, and create opportunity at home, as opposed to forcing people to leave, like is unfortunately happening a lot in Central America, where they leave, even risking their lives to the land of the free in their mind to pursue opportunities. We're trying to say, you know what, instead of exporting your people, why don't you import the conditions that the people are looking for? And we can do that in partnership at subnational levels initially, and then the country as a whole can, over time, adjust their policies to be world-class. But that takes longer if you do it at a national level.
Yeah. Yeah, I've heard about this immigration issue in the United States vaguely.
Yeah.
Coming up rather recently. Yeah, so Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek talked about the value of prices as a form of information to give to entrepreneurs and business owners what they need to do. So my favorite example of this is how many bagels do we need in London on next Tuesday morning? Now, of course, every little bagel maker, knows what he's going to need because last Tuesday, this is how many people we had or whatever. Could a central government ever figure that out? Well, I suppose in principle, like the Soviet Union tried to do, you collect data and make predictions. But your point is that they're going to be super slow and ineffective, behind the curve, making too many mistakes. And it could lumber along for decades, but at some point, it's just so inefficient that it collapses on itself.
Yes, and also the bigger the institution, the bigger the damage that can be caused if they get it wrong. If you have 10,000 small shops and a handful of them get it wrong, well, they might go out of business or they might have to correct, but the harm that they can cause is limited. If it's a centralized entity like a government and they get it wrong, then they push down the wrong decision on everybody all at once, and then you create a tremendous amount of harm. So it's also very risky to centralize decisions and power because of the amount of harm you can cause if you make mistakes.
Okay, we'll get into the details of your economic plan there in Prospera, but first, one more point on democracies. So a couple of years ago, I tweeted at Elon, when you start the first Mars colony, what documents would you recommend using to establish a governing system? U.S. Constitution, Bill of Rights, Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the Humanist Manifesto, Atlas Shrugged, Against the State, and Anarcho-Capitalist Manifesto. And he actually responded. He said, direct democracy by the people. Laws must be short, as there is trickery in length. Automatic expiration of rules to prevent death by bureaucracy. Any rule can be removed by 40% of people to overcome inertia. Freedom. And then he elaborated on it at a South by Southwest conference. Somebody asked him a similar question. And he said, most likely the form of government on Mars would be somewhat of a direct democracy where people vote directly on issues instead of going through representative government. When the United States was formed, representative government was the only thing that was logistically feasible. There was no way for people to communicate instantly. A lot of people didn't have access to mailboxes. The post office was primitive, etc. a lot of people couldn't write, so you had to have some form of representative democracy or things just wouldn't work at all. On Mars, everyone votes on every issue, and that's how it goes. There are a few things I'd recommend, which is keep laws short. Long laws. That's like something suspicious going on if there's long laws. You can always count on Elon to be colorful in how he describes these things. But what would your comment be on something like that, starting a new country somewhere?
Well, there's some very good features there, and we've adopted some of them in the Prospera governance system, including the fact that the population at large can at any time vote out rules that are passed. But before, what one must ask is, from a first principle perspective, is what is the government going to do? Because how people make decisions inside of an institution matters a lot depending on what the government is supposed to do. So if you accept as a matter of principle that governments have a proper role to regulate every dimension of human life, then do you really want direct democracy? Like, do you want the majority of people to define what individuals can and can't do? That's risky. I don't think I would go down that path. So the first thing to do is to enumerate the powers that such an entity that you call a government is going to have. Once you have that clear, then it follows that the structure by which you make decisions matter. But the first decision to make is about what decisions this entity gets to make. After that is how the decisions are made. So I am, as I said, the market is the most direct form of democracy, but it only gets to decide on matters that affect the people who are deciding themselves. There are derivative consequences by rewarding or punishing service providers, but because you only get to decide in the market without coercion on things that are relevant to you and which you can transact voluntarily, then sure, you get to decide on everything all the time without restrictions. But the moment that you can impose decisions, now it becomes tricky, right? Now now you enter into a world of morality and ethics, and you have to wonder, well, what gives the right to some? Doesn't matter, the percentage now becomes secondary, but what gives you the right to impose upon me a decision, or vice versa? What gives me the right to impose upon you my wishes? Should I be able to do it? Do I have to get 2 for 1? Do I have to get 4 to 1, 10 to 1? At what point does the individual lose its sovereignty in matters of personal decisions? So I think that's the first question to ask. And what you should do, and what we're trying to do, is you need to minimize the realms of collective action and imposed decisions that any entity, regardless of how they decide, can do for a whole bunch of other people. So the name of the game is stop thinking so much about how do you create the perfect monolithic one government, and it's maybe more about injecting competition and growing by a factor of 10, 100, or 1,000 the number of options that we have to choose from, so that now you have variability, you have real choice. Maybe the answer is not what is the right one size fits all, but how do we make sure that we have many more options and that the cost to switch from one option to the other is minimized, and perhaps that you can inject the right incentives in how some of these options emerge. So today, the marketplace of governance covers the entire earth, but there's only about 200 service providers. Only about 200 service providers, right? These are the number of, say, nation states. And of those 200 service providers, that sounds like a lot. The reality is that less than 5% control more than 80% of the market. And that is whether you measure it by revenues or people, right? So you have a very concentrated industry, which on top of it, almost every single provider loses money every year, highly indebted, very dissatisfied customer base, and most of them are structured in manners that are very hard to change. So instead of trying to make a single one be much better, I think we need to open it up for a whole bunch more to emerge with as much level of autonomy as it's possible, so that we can have innovation in the world of governance, which is what's been lacking for hundreds of years. And so I would defer from Elon to say, it's not really about thinking about how to do the one perfect structure. It's how do you create a system by which competition can be injected in governance and you can have a high degree of variability, a lot more choice, and ease of entering and exiting different jurisdictions.
Yeah, I had Robert Zubrin on the show. He's the author of the book on Mars, how to get there direct. Anyway, so that was his solution, exactly the same as yours, is just have lots of competition. So if you have some dictator that takes over one colony and says, I'm going to cut off the oxygen to your colony if you don't do X, you just move to a different colony where they don't cut off your oxygen, something like that. Yeah. So, okay. So how did you set up Prospera? You go to Honduras. I mean, why Honduras? Did you go to the government or the president, whoever, and go, can I lease a couple hundred acres and we'll give you 10% of the profits or whatever? And they go, okay. How does that work?
Well, so before talking about Honduras, I think we need to take a step back, because Prospera emerged out of New Way Capital. And when I created New Way Capital, I wanted to ignite this marketplace of innovation and governance. Okay, so the way we went about it is figured, well, look, let's fund and catalyze enhanced forms of special economic zones as a model to be replicated. Okay. And so from that perspective, it was like a venture capital fund dedicated in this very unique niche. We canvassed the world and we were looking for opportunities to partner with governments to create these types of special economic zones. And we had a great time over several years of visiting many places, from the Caribbean, Haiti, to Central America, Latin America, Eastern Europe, Africa. We canvassed the world in many places and signed a few MOUs. And surprisingly, the place where we started was in the US, actually. After canvassing the world, we figured that the best place to pursue our vision was in the US. And so we entered into an agreement with the state of Arizona. The governor at the time was Doug Ducey. He created a special commission to explore, these Prospera zones. And at the time, we were hypothesizing we would create a special zone on the border with Mexico, and I would have differentiated rules and regulations that would cater to a highly competitive environment that could benefit from best of both worlds: the rule of law environment of the US, cost of labor from Mexico, and then, of course, it wouldn't just be low cost labor, but anybody, and for advanced manufacturing as well. But while we were in the process of creating the legislative systems and passing laws locally in Arizona that would later be upgraded to the US so that you can have these almost federalized zones with autonomous rules and regulations, Honduras reached out to us and they said, that thing that you're talking about, that system of decentralization, of enhanced special economic zones, we have something that we think is what you're looking for, or at least can align to what you're looking for. And so this was 2015 when we were in Arizona. In 2013, so 2 years prior, Honduras had passed this ZEDE law, which it's like a special economic zone legislation that created indeed this what could be enhanced special economic zones. The organic law of the ZEDE is very good. It's very strategic. It builds on how Hong Kong was set up, how Dubai was set up, but it does not prescribe how the zones were to be set up. It basically says that, in Honduras, you can create enhanced special economic zones, and that within the zones, Congress can approve a highly differentiated set of rule sets. That's pretty much all it said, right? Okay, now we had a canvas upon which to potentially deploy a collection of international best practices, regardless of the fact that it's in Honduras. Why not attract the best of the best from all over the world and deploy them in one location? And so we, based on that invitation, went to Honduras, visited with the government, diligenced the law, visited the country, and we were pleasantly surprised. Indeed, the legal foundations were very interesting, very innovative. Were not super prescriptive, so indeed it allowed a lot of importation of international best practices. And the country was full of young people hungry for opportunities, unfortunately leaving by the hundreds of thousands per year to try to have a better life in the US. So you had what you could say a population that was very eager and in need of better services. And so we went through a period of about 2 years of understanding the system. We were the first partner to the Honduran government to propose the first ZEDE. It took us 3 years from when we started to when it was approved and the rule sets were all integrated. And so it was approved in 2017. It took about 3 years to develop the internal legal systems. And by 2020, we started breaking ground in our first location, which is on the island of Roatan, an island, a beautiful Caribbean island. It's part of Honduras, but it has a very unique history. It's a former British colony. It's a place where they speak English mostly. They use the dollar. It's a beautiful tourism destination, but largely undiscovered. And we thought the best example in the world of how this methodology has worked is in Asia. And to be very specific, in Hong Kong, and how it inspired Shenzhen on the mainland of China, and how Shenzhen then inspired dozens and dozens of additional special economic zones, which is in fact how China has become a world superpower. As you pointed out, they're not a democracy, but they do have a huge network of special economic zones which adopted free market capitalism in stages. But all of that was inspired by Hong Kong. So we figured, okay, we can build with the government of Honduras on the island of Roatan the equivalent of Hong Kong for the region. Perhaps the equivalent of Hong Kong to Honduras, where on the mainland we would then catalyze a more industrially focused city, which in Honduras, it's on the northern coast, a city called La Ceiba. We have a second footprint near La Ceiba with a vision of replicating what has worked elsewhere. But even though the intended outcome is the same, the innovation is in the methodology of being able to do this as a public-private partnership with private capital being invested, no money necessary from the government, bringing the best talent and a high degree of capital from anywhere in the world to unleash the trapped potential of, in this case, Hondurans. But frankly, it works the same anywhere, to unleash their potential, joining businessmen from abroad to businessmen from the country, creating jobs opportunities for the local population, and then tapping into the best world opportunities. So for Honduras, there is an opportunity in finance and healthcare out of the island of Roatan, but there's a huge nearshoring opportunity for the mainland as supply chains are relocating naturally, and then with COVID became exacerbated from being far and away on the east and in China to being on the Western hemisphere. So that's been the vision, and we're slowly implementing it, not without obstacles, as we can talk about in a bit. But it's a beautiful vision. It's a vision that is proven to work, and then it's scalable. Okay, so deploying it in Honduras is just a staging ground. It can be replicated by other companies or ourselves in any other part of the world.
Amazing, Eric. That's such a great story. Oh my God, so many questions come to mind. I mean, first of all, had you set up in Arizona, that would be one solution to the immigration problem. I mean, these aren't bad people. I mean, maybe some are, I guess, but most are just coming here. They want to work. And are you okay over there?
Yeah. Siri must have gotten triggered for some reason.
Oh, that was Siri. Yes, I thought I recognized that voice. I couldn't tell if it was Alexa or Siri. Gotta keep them separate so they don't get jealous. Anyway, yeah. So I mean, come on over. Except instead of going to San Diego or whatever, go to Prospera in Arizona there and work, and you'll have work for. Or maybe the new border czar can now send them all down to Honduras in your direction. But more seriously, so if say someone like Ford Motor Company says, well, we want to come down to Honduras and set up a factory in your neck of the woods there. And so who would work there? These are native Hondurans looking for work, and then they could work at this Ford plant, and then the Honduras government itself would profit from this because they would be paying their income tax and they'd be making money rather than being unemployed, and Prospera would make money and so on. So this is kind of the model you're describing, something like that.
Yeah, very much so. So in our setup in Honduras, part of the agreement through law is that 90% of the workforce has to be native, has to be Honduran in this case. And so while you create a system that provides significant regulatory, fiscal, and legal advantages so that companies can focus on what works and get rid of the burden of unnecessary rules and red tape, the flip side is, these are designed to be of tremendous benefit to the local population. So 90% of the workers have to be local. There's some exceptions. So if you have some key positions with specialized knowledge that you just don't find a Honduran for, then you go through a slightly different process. But the incentives are stacked in favor of hiring local. So the natural tendency is to set up training institutes, universities, and even schools, so that maybe they're not well trained right now, but within a few years, you have a local population that is well trained and available, and they're there. Expats are very expensive, no matter where in the world you try to take them. Very expensive, and skills can be taught. So there's a strong incentive to develop the local population. Prosperous zones are not tax-free zones. They comply, in fact, with the IMF standards so as to not be considered tax havens, because we wanted to make sure that these zones can be the tax jurisdiction for the companies operating within. Otherwise, there's a significant amount of double taxation. So they're not tax-free zones, but they're tax-optimized zones. So it's very straightforward, easy to file, and relatively low cost, certainly compared to the advantages you get. But of the taxes that are collected and the fees within the zone, the national government has a guaranteed revenue share percentage. So they have a direct benefit from all the revenues that are generated within the zone. And it's 12 to 15%. I'll leave it at a range for now, but imagine it's 15%. The remaining 85% stays inside to make sure that there's capital to fund so-called public access goods and services, because the whole idea is to create a world-class destination to do business in, to live, and to have a life in general. So it's not just like an industrial zone where companies have their office. It's literally housing and hospitals and education. I mean, the vision is you start as an economic zone, but you grow up into a thriving city, metropolitan area with all sorts of industries, not limited to any one industry. So basically replicating the Hong Kong and the Dubai models, but in partnerships, public-private partnerships. That's direct benefit, revenue share. And then, of course, with 90% of the workers having to be locals, then that means now their families have better incomes. They spend money inside and outside. You have supply chain considerations, building these places physically and then keeping them supplied with food and materials. It benefits the overall local economy because it becomes a magnet of demand. So there's a lot of direct benefits and indirect benefits, and it's like it's a combination of things that work in the world of economic development with the institutional structure and the incentive structure of entrepreneurship. You marry those two, and you have a rocket ship for economic development.
Yeah. Yeah, when I was in Dubai, I was asking my host, who built all these buildings? I mean, literally, physically built them. They said, well, mostly people from outside the country coming in for work. Yeah. And it's a massive amount, apparently. But yeah, so your team sent me photos of your Prospera there. It's gorgeous. Wow. The hiking, the swimming, snorkeling. Holy moly. Now, what's there now? If I came down tomorrow, what would I see?
Okay, so first of all, the Prospera has 3 areas in the country of Honduras, three different hubs. The main one is on the island of Roatan, and what you would see right now would look mostly like a resort community initially. Although you will see that there's something different already starting to happen, because there's a robotics factory. You wouldn't have a robotics factory in a resort, you have a high-rise tower that's mixed use, residential, office, retail. You have co-working spaces. It's a beautiful natural space, but it's very early. I mean, we started construction in mid 2020 while COVID was going on. The current footprint on Hub 1 is about 420 acres. It's intended to, over time, be about 750 acres. And to put it in perspective, Monaco is about 535 acres. Okay. So this is intended to be slightly larger than Monaco. With the capacity based on urban plans to occupy about 100, to house about 100,000 people between those that live and work. Okay. On the second hub, which we have not broken ground on yet, that's on the mainland of Honduras. And that would look more like an industrial park initially, focused on nearshoring operations, but with housing opportunities as well for the early employees that need to move. This is a bit of a more distant part from the main population centers of San Pedro and Tegucigalpa, so as to attract the top talent and keep them there. Not just about the factories, not just about the office, it's about their residential conditions. And so you would expect schools and hospitals as well. Back to Hub One for a second. You have schools inside and you have housing inside as well. And we have a beautiful golf course for what it's worth. And the vision, remember, of the Hong Kong to the Shenzhen analogy is that first you got to attract the capital and you got to attract top talent, because the true engine of an economy is not government and it's not just investors. You need talented people to build and grow their businesses. And as a consequence of having a comparative advantage to operate there, then you also hire. That's how you create jobs. So our first hub is designed to be world-class compatible with entrepreneurs from any part of the world.
Right. So if I'm an American and I want to invest in Prospera, say I got an extra $1 million laying around, and I come to you and let's say I invest in some of your startups or whatever. Do I still have to pay income? So let's say you double my money in 5 years. Do I have to pay capital gains to the federal U.S. government and taxes to Honduras, or how does it work?
As a U.S. citizen, unfortunately, we are all exposed to universal taxation. So regardless of where we invest, when we make money, we pay the U.S. government. And ultimately, right? I mean, maybe if the profits are left inside of an LLC or a company abroad, then, maybe not. But if you actually want to get access to it, as you know, eventually you'll pay the IRS. As to the business taxes that might be paid in the zone, you're only paying taxes where you're doing business. So there's no universal taxation by the U.S. government on companies that are owned by U.S. citizens, only when you're going to distribute the profits back to the beneficial owner if the beneficial owner is a U.S. citizen. So the answer is partly no, not at the business level. At the business level, you're just paying local taxes, which obviously go to the Honduran government and to the zone itself. But when you repatriate the profits, then you will pay the income taxes that apply to you in the U.S. if you repatriate.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And then in your area that you occupy, are there roads, and who owns the roads and who maintains the roads, and how do you pay for that, or any other public services?
Yeah. It's funny. People automatically associate roads as having to be public, but
I know.
but they don't
they
need to
don't.
be.
Yeah, I know.
No, they don't.
No,
So of course there are
not.
roads and everything, but they're all private. The infrastructure is private, and the thing is that as a developer, so we have the governance service provider, which is in partnership with the Honduran government, and they do the supervision. But then as a real estate developer, guess what? If you want to have a successful future city, you got to make sure there are roads and there are water mains and electric lines. And so, they're privately owned, and people pay a fee for using them, which tends to be according to their use, X amount of cents per gallon of water or percentage of the electric bill to handle the internal grid. And then for the roads, there's just a general service fee that people pay per year. And that's used to maintain the roads. In terms of investing to build them, it's part of the overall real estate investment. It's part of the horizontal infrastructure you have to lay in order to then build vertical developments that you can sell and rent. So none of it is public. All of it is private property.
Yeah. Yeah, I think in general, people kind of take these things for granted and assume there has to be public control of things like roads and electricity or whatever. But even where I live, I'm just up in the foothills here of Santa Barbara. I live on a private road, and all of us families, all the households, we all have to pay to maintain it. And we're on a well system because there's no public water up there. We have to drill a well, and it costs money. And the water is essentially free once the well is done, but it's expensive to put a well in. So you got to go, oh, I see. And then we have this cranky guy toward the top of the road. He doesn't use much of the road. So he goes, I don't want to pay for the road down there where you guys are using it because I only use this part. Like, oh, great. So we had to do this calculation of how much each of us of the road each of us uses, and then how much we have to pay. I suppose all planned communities have to do this, but if you think about it, like if you go to Google or Microsoft, they those are all private roads, and they have their own mail system and and so on. It's it's just hotels, giant malls. Those are all private roads, and this system is run by the proprietary owners of the place,
Right.
and so on and so forth. It's just what you get used to, I think.
It is, and there's also a timing implication. So, and a collective action issue. But if you start from the get go on a greenfield site with the vision of a private, development, then you embed a lot of these considerations into the CCNRs of the property, so that you can manage these private goods, but that have mass access to them. They're almost like public goods, but they're privately owned. And so if you can start from scratch as we have, then you just bake that into the system, and then it grows with time. So you don't have to then enter into a debate whether people should pay for the road or not. It's part of the deal. When they buy a plot of
Yeah.
land,
Yeah.
somewhere in their title is going to say, they're going to be fees assessed yearly, and to maintain these properties, and that's part of the deal.
Yeah. And then are there labor issues with the concerns that you or the companies that are investing in Prospera will take unfair advantage of the poor laborers in Honduras, for example?
I mean, some people will verbalize a concern, but in practice, the labor rights of workers within a Prospera zone are far higher and more strictly applied because, again, as the administrator, uh, our commitment, our responsibility is not to any one particular company or tenant. We are in the business of creating a generalized set of conditions so that, yes, a bunch of companies come, but also a bunch of employees and the best talent comes. And so our incentive is to create a rule of law environment. And in a rule of law environment, it's not about the business is always right. It's about, are you honoring the agreements that you've entered into? And so Honduras and by extension Prospera are governed by all sorts of international treaties of human rights and labor rights and all that sort of stuff. So we can comply with those. And frankly, most of the friction is not in the overall principles, but in the bureaucracy of having to go through the minutiae. The principle of paying fair wages, of paying people for the work that they do, of paying extra if they work beyond a certain amount of hours. I mean, those concepts are easy to comply with as a general principle. It's when you have a bureaucracy that is slow and delayed, that's where the problem is. So within the zone, you comply with all those standards. And then if you don't comply, or if there is a dispute, between a company and an employee as to whether or not, the employee got paid their severances, or God forbid, there's an accident and who should pay what, all that is adjudicated through a purpose-built labor tribunal inside of a arbitration center that must resolve the matter within 90 days. Sometimes these cases take years in countries like Honduras and in other places. Here, there's a guaranteed 90-day window maximum in which the issue is resolved. And it's not necessarily in favor of the company. It's in favor of what's fair, what the contract says, and what the international standards require.
Yeah. Two books I read on this. One was by Spencer Heath called The Art of Community, in which he talks about shopping centers are proprietary communities, as are condominium complexes, mobile home parks, retirement communities, industrial parks, private colleges and universities, corporate campuses like Microsoft, Apple, and Google. A hotel has its public and private areas, corridors for streets, and a lobby for its town square. In the lobby is the municipal park with its sculpture, fountains, and plantings. It has shopping areas where restaurants and retail stores bid for patronage. Its public transit system, as it happens, operates vertically instead of horizontally. When you rent a hotel room, included in the price are utilities such as water, electricity, heat, and air conditioning, and sewage. And for an extra fee, you get room service, current movies, and high-speed internet access. Well, now mostly that's free. Also provided are police and fire protection by security guards and sprinkler systems. Many hotels include a chapel for religious services, babysitting and play areas for children, pools for recreation, and bars for imbibing, concerts and plays, and even theater shows, especially Las Vegas. The main difference between this community and that of cities is that hotels are entirely private and organized by voluntary contract.
Yeah, that's all true.
So,
Fully
and
agreed.
in other words, it's been done. We're already doing this. So why not extrapolate it to larger areas? That's your point.
Exactly. And why not do it in parts of the world that need it the most, where a partnership between host nations and private capital makes a lot of sense. You mix the best of all worlds. You have a high need for much better services. As a result, there is a profit potential. There's a bit of an arbitrage opportunity, say in the cost of land, the cost of labor, in underdeveloped areas of the world. But if you can then bring in world-class standards, then that arbitrage accrues to those who help fill the gap between poverty and prosperity, which is exactly what you want. It's a pricing mechanism, it's an incentive structure. If allowed, the market work beautifully to attract the most capital, most energy to where it is needed most.
Yeah. My other example is the 2014 book by the economist Peter Leeson, Anarchy Unbound: Why Self-Governance Works Better Than You Think. Now, one of the critiques of that is, yeah, but you have these economic zones within traditional nation states, and what if the local army, the local president, and you get a new president of Honduras, and he goes, hey, I really like what you're doing there in Prospera. Thank you very much. We're just going to take over the whole place. Goodbye and good luck. And what are you going to do to stop my army from coming in?
Yeah. And this is not only a hypothetical risk, it's actually a situation we're facing in Honduras with a change of government 3 years ago that brought in a different ideologically aligned administration. And if they could have their way, they would get rid of the underlying system upon which we operate for exactly that reason. And no business model is born perfect. Um, and this is an innovative way to catalyze economic development. It's an innovative business model at the same time. So we're building it as we go. We're figuring out how to solve for those challenges, and we're seeing that there are mechanisms. For example, there's all sorts of legal structures that you can set in place from the beginning that provide you maximum level of legal protection and stability, leveraging international law and institutions like the World Bank and the Center for Investor State Dispute Resolutions. Countries have sovereignty, but they don't get to operate without consequence if they want to be part of the world economy. As a U.S. company, we're protected by international treaties that the U.S. and in this case Honduras and many countries around the world enter, and it's a condition to have access to the U.S. market that you play by certain rules, and those rules include that you honor and respect private property of U.S. companies that go and invest. So there is a multiple layers of legal protections that you can set up, and we've done that. The challenge is political. As you pointed out, what happens if the political will changes, and that's what we're going through. And I think the solution is going to look something well like in the world of politics. Like what gets a politician into power? What gets a politician into power is popularity ultimately, right? How they gain that popularity varies, but ultimately, in our case, I think it's not enough to just have legal protections. I think that Prospera needs to earn a license to operate, a social license to operate, and it must maintain it over time so that politicians don't have an incentive to go against something that is popular in the country. And so that's the stage we're in right now, really figuring out that fourth leg to the model, and how do we, we are convinced, we know that we're having such positive impact, but perception is reality in a democracy, for good and for bad. So if people don't perceive the good that you are doing, they cannot vote accordingly. And so that's a huge opportunity that we're going to be leaning into. How do we translate good in reality to good in the perception of the people, so that as they exercise their vote and voice their opinions, they can signal to the politicians that that Prospera is an attribute of the country that ought to be protected, not attacked.
Yeah. So if you don't want to spend money on a army, essentially a military force to defend your company, I guess you could have private security guards or something like that. Disincentivize anyone from wanting to just take it over violently because they're so successful. They're making so much money and it's so prosperous to be in business with you that they don't want to just take
Right.
your stuff.
Right. It's a combination of sticks and carrots. Indeed, you got to make it very costly
Right.
for them to destroy and profitable for them to maintain. And you know, the reality is that the world of human affairs, regardless of what we want to think morally, ethically, philosophically is right or the way it should be, is that people react to incentives, you know, and you can ignore it and try to cover the sun with a thumb, or you can just realize that that is why politics exists to begin with, and that you need to proactively channel that energy in the best possible way. And the good thing is that in the competition between systems as to which one generates the greatest amount of good to the greatest amount of people, there's no question that free market capitalism does that.